Human dragged the alien girl across a shattered glacier only for her guard to accuse him of abduction. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main characters. The wind howled across the desolate, broken expanse of the glacier, sharp and biting like needles. The ice cracked beneath Jake Anderson's boots as he dragged the unconscious alien girl, Talia, across the snow-covered terrain. He grunted with effort, his muscles aching as he pulled her along, aware that time was running out. The blizzard that had descended upon them without warning was relentless. His breath formed clouds in the freezing air, and every step was a struggle against the wind and the icy surface that threatened to swallow them both. Jake had been trained for situations like this, but nothing could have prepared him for the gravity of the situation he found himself in now. Talia, a beautiful alien with deep blue skin and eyes like molten silver, had been injured in a skirmish with her own people, left behind and abandoned to die in the freezing wilderness. Jake had found her, unconscious, barely clinging to life, and without hesitation, he had carried her, fighting against the harsh environment to get her to safety. He had been able to call in a rescue team, but they were hours away, and Talia's condition was worsening with every passing minute. He needed to get her to the shelter, to warmth, before it was too late. As he dragged her along, Jake's mind raced. He couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, his senses alert to the distant sound of approaching footsteps. In the howling wind, it was impossible to see, but he knew they were coming. The guards would be here soon. The guards who had chased him down for daring to touch the Queen's clone, for daring to help her. He cursed under his breath, gritting his teeth. It didn't matter. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to leave her to die out here, no matter what they said. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the edge of the glacier, where the makeshift shelter stood, a small cabin that had been hastily constructed. He rushed inside, setting Talia down on a cot and quickly covering her with a thermal blanket. His hands trembled slightly as he checked her pulse, relieved to find it steady, though weak. At least she was still alive. He took a moment to catch his breath, his heart pounding in his chest, but the relief was short-lived. A loud bang echoed outside the cabin door, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy boots crunching through the snow. Jake's body tensed, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side, though he knew he wouldn't need it. He could already hear the authoritative voice of Officer Sorrow, one of Talia's guards, barking orders as he approached. Jake took a deep breath and steadied himself. He had made his decision. There was no turning back now. He wasn't going to be intimidated by threats or accusations. As the door swung open, Sorrow's piercing red eyes locked onto him, his gaze sharp with suspicion and anger. "You're too late, human," Sorrow said coldly. "You've crossed a line." Jake didn't flinch. "I saved her life." Sorrow's eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward, his armored boots clanging against the wooden floor. "You've abducted her. You have no right to touch her." The word stung, but Jake refused to back down. She was dying out there. "I didn't kidnap her, I helped her." Sorrow's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching near the weapon at his side. "You're a fool. You have no idea what you've done." The tension in the room thickened as Sorrow loomed over Jake, but Jake stood his ground, eyes locked on the alien guard. "I did what any decent person would have done. I saved her." Talia stirred on the cot, her breathing shallow but steady. She lifted her head slightly, her silver eyes meeting Jake's with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "He saved me," she whispered, her voice weak but firm. Sorrow's gaze flicked toward her, then back to Jake, a flicker of doubt crossing his features for the briefest moment. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by cold resolve. "This isn't over, human," he warned, turning on his heel and marching toward the door. "You will pay for this." Jake didn't say a word. He knew the risks, knew the consequences, but none of it mattered. All that mattered now was that Talia was safe. For now, at least. The wind had died down somewhat, leaving a thick silence that seemed to press against Jake's chest as he watched Officer Sorrow storm off. He stood in the small cabin, the faint glow of the dim lantern casting shadows on the walls. Talia's breath was slow but steady now, and the warmth of the blanket over her body seemed to ease some of the tension in the air. Jake wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, exhausted, both physically and mentally. He had barely managed to get Talia inside before the storm intensified, and now, here they were trapped in a cabin with no way out. He had never imagined things would escalate so quickly. Talia, the alien girl who had once been a target of hostility from her own people, now lay in his care, vulnerable and weak. His protective instincts had taken over when he had found her in the snow, but now, with her life in his hands, the weight of the situation truly settled in. He wasn't sure what would happen next. Would the guards come for her, for him? Would anyone believe that his intentions were pure? He couldn't be certain, but what he knew was that he wouldn't leave her behind. Not like this. Talia stirred again, her eyes fluttering open, and for a moment, she looked confused. Her silvery eyes scanned the room, eventually locking with his. Jake, her voice was weak, like a whisper barely breaking the silence. Why, did you help me? Her words felt like a question that carried the weight of everything they had been through together in such a short amount of time. He exhaled slowly, wiping his hands on his pants before responding. Because it was the right thing to do, he said simply, his voice firm, though his heart raced. No one should be left out there to die, especially not someone who can't defend themselves. Talia looked down at her hands, her brows furrowing as she tried to sit up. Jake moved closer, ready to help her, but she shook her head slightly, a look of determination crossing her features. I don't need your pity, she muttered softly, her voice full of resolve. Jake nodded, his expression softening. I'm not pitying you, he said. I'm helping you because I believe in doing the right thing. Talia studied him for a moment longer, her eyes scanning his face, as if weighing his words. Finally, she let out a small sigh and relaxed back into the blankets. I suppose I can trust you, then, she whispered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. But I don't understand, why are you doing this for me? Why are you risking your life for someone like me? Jake sat on the edge of the cot, taking a moment before responding. He looked at her, seeing her vulnerability for the first time without the armor of her fierce warrior nature. Because I see you, he said softly. Not as an enemy or a mission, but as someone who deserves a chance. And right now, that means keeping you alive. She looked at him in silence, her mind processing his words. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The room was quiet except for the occasional creaking of the wooden cabin as it settled. Jake stayed at her side, unwilling to leave her alone in her state, even as the reality of their situation loomed over them. Outside, the storm raged on, and he knew they couldn't stay here forever. They had to move, to find a way to get her to safety before anyone else came looking. But for now, he could offer her warmth and safety, something that, despite all the chaos, felt like the least he could do. Talia's hand twitched slightly, and Jake realized she had fallen asleep again. He sat there for a moment longer, just watching her. The weight of the world seemed to bear down on him, but he wasn't about to back down. Not now. He would protect her, even if it meant fighting the entire galaxy. The stakes were high, but Jake had never been afraid of a challenge. Morning light seeped through the thin cabin walls, soft and pale, casting faint shapes across the wooden floor. Jake sat near the small heater, its steady hum the only sound breaking the quiet. He checked on Talia again, noting the color returning to her deep blue skin. Her breathing was steadier now, less strained, and for the first time since he had found her on the glacier, she looked peaceful. Outside, the storm had calmed, leaving the world wrapped in a blanket of white that stretched for miles in every direction. Jake rubbed his hands together, warming them as he listened for any hint of approaching footsteps. Nothing. Only stillness. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. For a moment, it felt like the world had paused. Talia stirred faintly, her silver eyes blinking open. She looked around as if orienting herself, then focused on Jake. Is it morning already? She asked softly, her voice slightly stronger than the night before. He nodded. The worst of the storm passed. You made it through the night. How are you feeling? Talia shifted slightly under the blanket, thoughtful. Tired. But alive. Thanks to you. Jake felt a warmth spread through him at her words, though he tried to hide it. You do not owe me anything, he said. Anyone would have done the same. She tilted her head, studying him with a quiet seriousness. Not everyone would have stayed. Not everyone would have carried me across a glacier. Jake glanced away, suddenly self-conscious. Well, I could not just leave you there, he said quietly. You deserved a chance to make it. Talia gave a small smile, one that almost seemed to bring light into the dim cabin. Your people are strange, she murmured, more to herself than to him. I have been taught that humans are driven by gain, not compassion. Yet here you are. Jake shrugged gently. Maybe you met the wrong humans. Her eyes lingered on him for a long moment, reflective, as if something inside her was shifting. Before either of them could speak again, a faint sound carried through the frosted window. Not heavy footsteps like before, but something more distant. The low hum of engines. Jake moved quickly to the window, brushing away the thin layer of frost with his sleeve. Down the slope, partially obscured by drifting snow, a small patrol craft skimmed across the ice. Its lights scanned the landscape in wide arcs, glowing in soft pulses. Talia inhaled sharply. They are searching, she whispered. Jake nodded slowly. Looks like it. The craft passed by without slowing, but its presence sent a ripple of tension through the room. Jake stepped back from the window, mind racing. They could not stay much longer. If the patrol circled back, they would be discovered. He glanced at Talia, who watched him with a calm but uncertain expression. We need to move soon, he said gently. But we will go at your pace. I will not push you beyond what you can handle. Talia's gaze softened. You keep saying that, she whispered. But no one has ever spoken to me that way. Jake met her eyes, steady and sincere. Then maybe it is time someone did. A fragile silence settled between them, full of unspoken meaning. Outside, the snow glittered under the pale morning sun, and somewhere beyond the cabin walls, the world waited for their next step. The morning passed in a tense quiet, the kind that only comes when the air is thick with unspoken thoughts. Jake moved around the cabin, packing up what little gear he had and organizing the few supplies that remained. He could feel Talia's gaze on him as he worked, though he didn't meet her eyes. His mind was elsewhere, running through plans, options, trying to figure out their next move. The sound of the patrol craft still echoed in his mind. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. He finished packing the last of his things and looked at Talia. She was sitting up now, her gaze distant but focused. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though she still looked weak, she was stronger than when he had found her. Ready to go? He asked, his voice gentle but steady. She nodded, her silver eyes locking with his. I will be. There was something in her voice, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to make it out of this. They stepped outside together, the cold air biting at their skin as they took in the surrounding landscape. The glacier stretched before them, vast and empty, save for the distant silhouette of the patrol craft still drifting through the snow. Jake squinted against the sunlight reflecting off the snow and turned his attention to the horizon. They needed to move quickly. He pointed toward a ridge in the distance. We'll head that way, he said. The patrol won't expect us to be heading toward the higher ground. It will give us a better chance of staying hidden. Talia followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the path he had indicated. And what if they spot us? She asked, her voice tinged with caution. Then we fight. Or we run. Jake didn't flinch as he spoke, his mind already racing through contingencies. The stakes were high, but he wasn't about to back down now. He had made a promise to keep her safe, and he wasn't going to break it. Together, they began their trek toward the ridge, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The air grew colder the higher they climbed, but Jake barely noticed. He was focused entirely on the path ahead, his senses alert for any sign of danger. Talia, though still weak, kept pace with him, her movements more assured than before. They climbed steadily, neither of them speaking much. The silence was almost comforting, a break from the chaos they had faced. As they neared the ridge, Jake could hear the faint hum of the patrol craft growing louder. They were getting closer, but he didn't want to stop. They were almost there. Talia stumbled, and Jake instinctively reached out to steady her. "I'm fine," she muttered, pulling away from his grasp. "Just tired." Jake nodded but didn't let go of her. "We'll rest when we get to the top." They pushed on, their legs burning from the climb, but Jake kept his focus. As they neared the top, the sound of the patrol craft grew louder, and he knew they had to make it over the ridge before they were seen. With one final push, they reached the top, collapsing into the snow. Jake's chest heaved with exertion, but he didn't pause to catch his breath. He crawled to the edge of the ridge and peered down below. The patrol craft was just over a mile away, hovering lazily in the distance. They were still out of sight, but not for long. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said quietly, looking at Talia. She nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "We keep going." They both knew that their journey wasn't over, but for the first time, Jake allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. They could make it. They had to. The ridge was steeper than Jake had anticipated, the snow shifting beneath his boots with every step. They had made it to the top, but the real challenge was just beginning. As he glanced over at Talia, he could see the toll the climb had taken on her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her usually strong movements now sluggish and labored. Jake slowed his pace, matching his steps to hers, ready to help if needed. "You doing okay?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was thinner than usual. They reached a small outcrop of rocks at the top, and Jake suggested they rest for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the patrol. The last thing they needed was to be caught in the open. Talia settled down onto a large rock, pulling her knees to her chest for warmth. Jake did the same, keeping a close watch on the sky. The storm had passed, but the cold was unrelenting, biting at their exposed skin. After a few minutes, Jake stood up and peered over the ridge. He could make out the silhouette of the patrol craft in the distance, still hovering near the glacier's edge. It was hard to tell if they had spotted them yet, but it was clear that they wouldn't be safe here for long. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, turning back to Talia. She met his gaze, her silver eyes steady. "I know." With a deep breath, she pushed herself up and joined him. They continued along the ridge, moving cautiously but steadily. Jake led the way, scanning the terrain for any sign of danger. As they neared the edge of the glacier, a loud, distant sound caught his attention. A crack echoed through the air, followed by a deep rumble. Talia's eyes widened as she looked around. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tense. Jake frowned, instinctively stepping closer to her. "Avalanche," he muttered. "We've got to move, now." They broke into a run, the ground shaking beneath their feet as the snow began to shift and slide. Jake's heart raced as he pushed himself harder, determined to stay ahead of the impending avalanche. Talia was just behind him, her breathing heavy, but she was keeping up. For a moment, it seemed like the world was closing in around them, the snow and ice shifting violently. Jake felt the cold wind whip around him, the sound of the avalanche growing louder. He turned briefly to check on Talia, but she was already pushing herself forward, her expression one of fierce determination. They reached a narrow crevice in the rock face just as the avalanche hit, the snow rushing past them with terrifying speed. Jake grabbed Talia's arm, pulling her into the crevice as the snow crashed down behind them, blocking off their only route of escape. They were trapped. The world outside was a blur of white, the roar of the avalanche still echoing in their ears. But inside the crevice, there was a momentary silence. Jake's breath was ragged, and Talia was pressed close to him, both of them shivering from the cold and the adrenaline. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The danger had passed, but they were far from safe. Jake glanced down at Talia, his heart pounding in his chest. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, though her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly. "I think so," she said, her voice strained. "That was too close." Jake nodded, his mind already moving forward. They had to figure out their next move, and quickly. He turned his attention to the crevice, checking the walls for any way through. It was tight, but there might be a way out if they could climb. As he prepared to move again, Talia reached out and placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Jake," she said softly. "Thank you. For everything." He met her gaze, his expression softening. "I'm not leaving you behind," he said simply. "Not now. Not ever." Talia didn't say anything else, but her eyes told him everything. She was beginning to believe in him, in them. Together, they would find a way out of this. And maybe, just maybe, they would survive this hellish journey together. Snow settled over the crevice like a heavy curtain, muffling every sound from the world outside. Jake's breath formed faint clouds in the cold air as he studied the narrow walls around them. The avalanche had sealed the entrance behind them, and though they were safe for the moment, they were also trapped. Talia leaned against the stone, her eyes closed as she tried to steady her breathing. The climb, the cold, and the sheer strain of their journey were catching up to her. Jake moved closer, careful not to startle her. "We need to find a way through," he said quietly. "The crevice might open somewhere deeper in." Talia opened her eyes, studying him with a tired but attentive gaze. "You think this leads somewhere?" Jake pointed toward a narrow passage that veered downward into the rock. "There is airflow. That means it is not sealed. There might be an exit." Talia nodded slowly, pushing herself upright. "Then we should try." She shivered as a draft of icy air swept through the passage. Jake noticed immediately and removed his own thermal jacket, wrapping it around her shoulders before she could protest. "Before you say it," he said, anticipating her response, "I will be fine." "You needed more." Her expression softened. "Humans are unexpectedly selfless." He smiled faintly. "Maybe just stubborn." Together, they moved into the narrow tunnel. The walls were rough, glistening faintly where the trapped light hit patches of ice. Jake led the way, one hand brushing the wall for guidance, the other helping Talia as the path became uneven. The air was cold but carried a faint scent of open space somewhere ahead. "Jake," Talia said after a while, her voice echoing softly off the stone. "When my guard accused you, you did not deny helping me. You did not try to explain yourself. Why?" He slowed, glancing back at her. "Would it have mattered?" She hesitated. "To him? Perhaps not. But to me, yes." Jake paused, letting her words settle. "I figured staying alive was more important in that moment," he replied. "Explanations can come later." Talia's steps faltered slightly, and Jake steadied her again. "Your action meant more to me than any explanation could," she murmured. "You acted out of instinct. You protected me, even when it cost you." Jake said nothing for a moment, focusing on the path. "I did it because it was right," he answered finally. "That is all." The tunnel widened abruptly, opening into a small cavern lit by the pale glow of ice formations. The air was gentler here, less biting, and Jake exhaled in relief. "We can rest for a moment," he said, helping Talia sit on a flat ledge of stone. She settled carefully, pulling the jacket tighter around her. "Jake," she said again, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. "On my world, duty often overrides compassion. We make choices based on logic, tradition, expectation." She looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, one of genuine vulnerability. "You make choices based on heart. My people do not understand that." Jake sat beside her, though he kept a respectful distance. "Maybe that is why I found you," he said gently. "Maybe someone needed to show you a different way of seeing things." Talia lowered her gaze, thoughtful. "Perhaps," she whispered. For a brief moment, the cavern felt warmer, as if the air itself was responding to the shift between them. Jake cleared his throat softly. "Once we get out of here, we will figure out what comes next. Together." Talia's eyes lifted to meet his. Together, she echoed, the word carrying a weight neither of them fully understood yet. But it was enough. Outside, the world waited. For now, they had hope and each other. The cavern around them seemed to hum with the soft pulse of life, its icy walls reflecting the quiet tension in the air. Jake stood, scanning the narrow exit of the small cavern, his breath steady but his mind alert. The faint light of the ice formations had begun to fade, and he knew they needed to move soon. Talia had closed her eyes for a moment, resting, but Jake could see the weight of the journey settling on her, her body still weakened, though her spirit seemed stronger with each passing hour. They had been walking for what felt like days, but in reality, it had been less than 2. Still, it felt like an eternity, each moment pulling them deeper into a world that was both beautiful and unforgiving. We need to keep going, Jake said softly, glancing back at Talia, who was now looking at him. Her silver eyes caught the faint light from the ice, their gaze steady and unwavering. I know, she replied, pushing herself to her feet, the jacket Jake had given her still wrapped tightly around her. The cold had seeped into her bones, but there was something about the way she carried herself now that told Jake she was no longer just a wounded alien in need of saving. She was a warrior, perhaps a different kind of warrior, but a warrior nonetheless. I don't know how much farther we can go, she added, her voice tinged with weariness. Jake met her gaze, his expression firm but understanding. One step at a time, he said, offering a small but genuine smile. We've made it this far. We can make it the rest of the way. Talia nodded, a flicker of determination crossing her features. Then let's go. They moved forward through the tunnel, the sound of their boots crunching against the icy surface reverberating in the silence. As they pressed on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The soft wind that had been blowing through the crevices of the cavern had stopped, and the air had grown unnervingly still. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed to stretch longer. He glanced behind them once more, scanning for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the cold. Just the silence. Jake, Talia said, breaking the quiet, her voice low and uncertain. Do you ever think about why we are here? Why we ended up like this? Why you found me? Jake's heart skipped a beat at the question. It was a question he had asked himself 100 times since their paths had crossed. He thought about the endless stretches of snow, the glimmering ice beneath their feet, and how this strange journey had pulled him into something larger than he could have ever imagined. I think it's fate, he replied slowly, carefully. I think sometimes, we don't choose the paths we walk. They choose us. And we just have to figure out how to keep going. Talia was silent for a moment, as though weighing his words. She walked alongside him, her steps measured and deliberate, her expression contemplative. Fate, she repeated, as if trying the word on for size. Maybe that is it. The two of them continued in silence for a while longer, the path growing steeper and more treacherous. The exit of the cavern was close now, the tunnel narrowing into a jagged opening that led to the surface. They could almost taste the fresh air, the freedom, and with it came the promise of survival. But as they neared the exit, Jake's senses went on high alert. A sound, distant but distinct, echoed from outside the tunnel. The faint hum of engines. The unmistakable sound of a patrol craft. Talia's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of panic in her gaze. They're here, she whispered, a tremor in her voice. Jake gritted his teeth. Stay behind me, he said, his tone sharp. But calm. He moved toward the exit, pushing himself ahead of her, but she stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. I will fight if I must, she said, her voice firm. Jake turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet understanding. We don't have to fight. Not yet. The patrol was getting closer, but they were so close now. The outside world was just within reach, and Jake knew they had to move fast. Come on, he urged, his voice steady but urgent. Let's make it out of here. Together. Talia nodded, and together, they pushed toward the exit. The bright daylight beyond the cavern was almost blinding after the darkness, but it was a welcome sight. The snow stretched out before them, and the patrol craft was still some distance away, but closing fast. We can make it, Jake said under his breath. Talia was already moving ahead, her pace quickening as she picked up speed. Jake followed close behind, feeling a sense of urgency surge through him. The final stretch was ahead, and the world beyond awaited. The wind howled as they broke free from the tunnel, emerging into the wide-open snowfield. The daylight was blinding after the darkness of the cavern, and Jake squinted against the harsh light. The patrol craft, still far off but rapidly approaching, hovered above the icy ground, casting a shadow over the snow. The engines hummed, and the sound of them seemed to reverberate through the frozen landscape. Jake's heart raced. They had no time to waste. "Run," he called to Talia, urging her to move faster. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they sprinted across the open field, the cold air biting at their faces. Talia, though exhausted, kept pace with him, her body responding with a determination that surprised Jake. It was as if every step forward was a challenge, but she refused to back down. Behind them, the sound of the patrol craft grew louder. They were being chased, and Jake knew they couldn't outrun it for long. The wide expanse of snow gave them nowhere to hide, nowhere to take cover. It was just them, the open ice, and the craft steadily gaining on them. Talia's breath came in sharp bursts, her exhaustion catching up with her, but she refused to slow. Jake kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for anything, any sign of shelter, any place to turn. There had to be a way out. "There!" Jake shouted, pointing to a distant ridge. A series of jagged rocks formed a natural barricade, a narrow gap between them leading deeper into the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was their best chance. "Head for the gap." Talia nodded without hesitation, her feet pushing harder against the snow as she made her way toward the ridge. Jake followed closely behind, his eyes darting from the ridge to the patrol craft. They were close, too close. The craft was hovering above the snow now, its searchlights flashing across the field, cutting through the snow and ice like beams of laser light. Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. This was it. They had to make it to the ridge. Talia reached the rocks first, her body moving with a final surge of energy. She dove into the gap between the rocks, her arms outstretched as she scrambled for purchase. Jake was right behind her, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. The patrol craft was just moments away from spotting them. "Hurry," he urged, his voice tight. Talia's fingers found the ledge, and she pulled herself up with a grunt. Jake grabbed her arm and helped her over the rocks, his muscles screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. Once they were on the other side, they crouched low, hidden from the view of the craft. The patrol passed over them, its searchlights sweeping across the ridge, but they were safely tucked away in the shadows. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The craft flew past them, circling back, its engines roaring as it searched the snowfield. Jake and Talia remained motionless, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the craft disappeared into the distance, the sound of its engines fading. They had made it. They were safe, for now. Talia let out a long breath, the tension slowly leaving her body. She leaned back against the cold stone, her eyes closing briefly as she recovered. Jake, still watching the sky, finally allowed himself to relax. "That was too close," he muttered. Talia opened her eyes and met his gaze. "You didn't leave me," she said softly. "You could have. You could have saved yourself. But you didn't leave me." Jake shook his head, his voice quiet. "I wasn't going to leave you. Not when you needed me." Talia was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't just gratitude in her words. It was something deeper, something Jake couldn't quite place, but he felt it in his chest. She trusted him. He had earned her trust. They were far from safe, but for the first time since they had met, Jake allowed himself to believe that they could make it out of this alive. Together. The hours passed in tense silence as Jake and Talia waited in the small crevice, the danger of the patrol now behind them. The air was frigid, and though the immediate threat had passed, they both knew that they couldn't afford to relax just yet. The ridge they had hidden behind was a temporary refuge, but they couldn't stay there forever. Jake glanced at Talia, who was sitting with her back against the cold rock, her head resting against the stone, her eyes closed. Her breathing was steady now, though the exhaustion was evident on her face. He knew she was pushing herself harder than she should have been, but he also knew she wouldn't stop until they were both safe. "We can't stay here much longer," Jake said quietly, his voice low so it wouldn't carry. They could circle back or send out more patrols. Talia opened her eyes slowly, her silvery gaze meeting his. "I know. But we've made it this far." She paused for a moment, her lips pressing together as she seemed to think. "What now?" Jake looked around, trying to focus despite the fatigue. The ridge had given them a brief moment of safety, but it wasn't a long-term solution. "We need to get to higher ground," he said after a moment. "There's a pass farther up the mountain. It's not far, but it'll take us off the radar. Once we're in the pass, we can figure out where to go from there." Talia nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "And if we're spotted?" Jake's jaw tightened. "We run. Or we fight. But we don't stop." She didn't respond immediately, but Jake could see the flicker of resolve in her eyes. She had been through enough to understand the weight of his words. The choice was clear, they had to keep moving forward. Slowly, Talia stood, swaying slightly as the exhaustion hit her again. Jake reached out to steady her, but she waved him off. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little sharper than before, though there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "Let's get this over with." They began moving again, their steps careful but quick. The snow beneath their feet was softer now, the path rising steeply toward the pass Jake had mentioned. The mountain was quiet around them, the only sound the crunch of their boots and the occasional whistle of the wind. The cold had begun to seep through their layers again, but the urgency of their situation kept them moving. As they ascended, Jake kept his eyes on the surrounding terrain, alert for any signs of danger. It felt like they were being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with every passing second. Talia seemed to sense it too. "They're still out there," she murmured as they neared the crest of the hill. Jake didn't respond, but his hand instinctively moved to the weapon at his side, his fingers tightening around the hilt. They reached the top of the hill and crouched behind a large boulder, peering out to scan the area. Below them, the valley stretched out, the white expanse broken only by patches of rock and ice. It was still clear of patrols for now, but the craft could return at any moment. Jake exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. "We need to stay low," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll move fast, but we don't risk being seen." Talia nodded again, her body tense as she prepared to move. She was still recovering, but she wasn't about to let the danger slow her down. Jake looked at her one last time before they started down the other side of the hill. "We stick together," he said firmly. "No matter what happens, we make it through this." Talia's gaze met his, her expression unreadable. But in that moment, he saw something shift in her eyes. Trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Together, they moved forward into the unknown, their every step bringing them closer to the future they both hoped for. No matter how long the journey would be, Jake was determined to keep her safe. He had made a promise, and he would not break it. The mountain ahead seemed endless, but with Talia by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. Together.